Some mysteries refuse to fade with time. Instead, they grow stranger, leaving behind questions that seem more impossible with every passing year. This is one of those mysteries where every answer uncovered only revealed another layer of uncertainty until the truth became harder to recognize. It began on a quiet December night when winter settled over Austin, Texas, and most people believed the day had already ended without incident. The streets emptied as businesses locked their doors, holiday lights shimmered in nearby neighborhoods, and an ordinary shopping center slipped into silence. Nothing about that evening hinted that, before sunrise, one small frozen yogurt shop would become the center of a tragedy still unsolved decades later. Long after customers had gone home, only a handful of lights remained inside the shop, where 4 teenage girls finished the final tasks before closing. Outside, everything appeared peaceful. Inside, the last ordinary moments of 4 young lives quietly slipped away, unnoticed by everyone around them. Just after midnight, flames suddenly burst through the windows, turning a neighborhood business into an emergency that drew firefighters across the city. At first, responders believed they were racing toward another commercial fire. Dangerous but familiar, something experience had prepared them to confront. Instead, as smoke slowly cleared, they stepped into a crime scene so devastating that investigators would spend decades trying to understand what happened. The fire had not simply damaged the building, it had also erased evidence, making the first hours of the investigation unusually difficult from the start. Before detectives could identify a suspect, they faced an even greater challenge. They first had to determine exactly what crime had taken place. The victims were Amy Ayers, just 13 years old, the youngest member of the group working that Friday evening before the Christmas holidays. Alongside Amy were sisters Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, both trusted employees whose family expected them home after another routine shift at the shop. The 4th victim, Eliza Thomas, was preparing for the future, balancing work, school, friendships, and the ordinary ambitions of a 17-year-old. None of them were involved in dangerous professions. They weren't public figures. They were simply teenagers working part-time after school. The frozen yogurt shop sat inside a modest shopping center in North Austin, serving families, students, and nearby residents throughout the neighborhood. Friday evenings were often busy, especially during the holiday season when customers stopped in after shopping or meeting friends nearby. By closing time, business slowed, and the remaining employees focused on cleaning equipment, balancing receipts, and preparing for another day. Nothing publicly documented from those final routine moments suggested panic, conflict, or anything unusual unfolding inside the store. Families expected their daughters to return home before long, unaware that something had already interrupted the evening in ways no one yet understood. Hours later, the fire alarm changed everything, although even then, no one imagined the true horror waiting behind the smoke-filled windows. Investigators quickly realized the blaze itself wasn't the primary crime. Someone had intentionally set the fire after violence had already occurred inside. That discovery immediately transformed a fire investigation into one of Texas's largest homicide investigations, demanding resources from multiple agencies. Yet the very act intended to destroy evidence also complicated every future attempt to reconstruct the final hours inside the yogurt shop. Heat damaged physical evidence. Water from firefighting efforts altered the scene further. Valuable forensic opportunities disappeared before investigators could preserve them. Despite those setbacks, detectives refused to assume the fire had erased every clue. Careful examination began almost immediately. Every surviving fragment mattered, no matter how small, because each piece could explain who entered the store and why. The first task was establishing a reliable timeline, beginning with when the girls were last seen alive by customers and nearby witnesses. Investigators interviewed employees from neighboring businesses, searching for anyone who noticed suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar faces, or unusual activity before closing. Dozens of people came forward with observations, but memory proved far less reliable than detectives had hoped during those crucial early days. Some witnesses believed they saw unfamiliar young men near the shopping center. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. Those conflicting accounts forced investigators to separate verified facts from assumptions, a process that would continue for years. As news spread across Austin, fear replaced the city's holiday spirit, and parents questioned whether random violence had entered their own neighborhoods. Residents struggled to understand why 4 teenage girls working an ordinary evening shift had become victims of such extraordinary violence. Without arrests, speculation quickly filled the silence left by unanswered questions, creating challenges investigators constantly fought to overcome. Rumors traveled faster than evidence, pointing towards strangers, local criminals, organized groups, and countless possibilities unsupported by confirmed facts. Behind closed doors, detectives focused less on rumors and more on reconstructing every verified movement surrounding the victim's final evening. Receipts, work schedules, telephone records, and witness interviews slowly formed the earliest outline of that December night. Still, the central question remained painfully simple: who entered the yogurt shop after closing, and what happened once they were inside? Weeks passed without meaningful breakthroughs, despite hundreds of investigative leads arriving from across Texas and beyond. Each promising lead demanded careful examination, yet one after another failed to produce evidence strong enough to identify a responsible suspect. The investigation expanded dramatically, involving forensic specialists, homicide detectives, and federal assistants as pressure mounted to solve the case. For the victims' families, every passing day without answers deepened grief already made unbearable by the circumstances surrounding the murders. Public attention remained intense, ensuring investigators faced not only enormous expectations but constant scrutiny over every decision they made. Years passed, and although countless hours had been invested, the case remained suspended between possibility and uncertainty. Then investigators began reconsidering people who had previously attracted little public attention, believing overlooked connections might finally explain the crime. Fresh interviews, renewed analysis, and persistent detective work slowly shifted the direction of the investigation toward a small group of young men. After years with no clear suspect, it suddenly appeared the investigation was finally gaining momentum toward long-awaited answers. But the breakthrough that seemed ready to solve the yogurt shop murders would soon raise questions far more difficult than the ones it answered. By the mid-1990s, the investigation had reached a frustrating point. Thousands of hours had been invested, yet the case remained without a clear resolution. Detectives returned to earlier interviews, convinced that overlooked details sometimes become meaningful only after months or even years of careful comparison. One name led to another, then another, until investigators found themselves examining a small circle of young men connected through friendships and acquaintances. None of them had been charged, none had publicly confessed, but detectives believed they deserved a much closer look. Investigators began conducting lengthy interviews, hoping inconsistencies, memories, or unexpected admissions might reveal what physical evidence no longer could. Hours turned into days as questioning continued, with detectives comparing every statement against surviving forensic evidence and witness accounts. Eventually, the investigation reached a dramatic turning point. One suspect admitted involvement in the murders during police questioning. Soon afterward, additional statements emerged from others connected to the investigation, creating the appearance that detectives had finally solved the mystery. For many people following the case, the news brought relief. After years of uncertainty, justice finally seemed within reach. 4 young men eventually became the focus of the investigation, each accused of participating in the crimes inside the yogurt shop. On paper, the case suddenly appeared remarkably strong. Investigators had suspects, detailed statements, and confessions supporting their theory. Yet, experienced detectives understand an uncomfortable truth. A confession alone does not automatically establish what actually happened. Every confession must be measured against independent evidence, known facts, and details that only the true perpetrators could accurately describe. As prosecutors reviewed the statements, investigators began comparing every claimed event with the surviving evidence collected from the crime scene. That comparison revealed something troubling. The confessions did not always match one another in significant ways. Certain timelines differed, some descriptions conflicted with physical evidence, other details changed during repeated questioning. Detectives now faced an unexpected challenge. Had they uncovered the truth or something far more complicated? The investigation continued, not because police abandoned the confessions, but because important questions still demanded reliable answers. How many offenders had actually entered the yogurt shop that night? The available evidence could not answer with complete certainty. Investigators also examined whether every person who confessed had first-hand knowledge or whether some information came from another source. These questions mattered because accurate confessions usually contain details unknown to the public, details investigators can independently verify. The more closely detectives examined the statements, the more complicated the picture became. Some information aligned with known facts. Other portions appeared inconsistent, incomplete, or difficult to reconcile with existing evidence. Defense attorneys later argued that the lengthy interrogations themselves deserved careful scrutiny, particularly the circumstances surrounding those admissions. Prosecutors, however, believed the overall evidence still supported moving the case toward trial despite the emerging disputes. As legal preparations advanced, another development quietly approached, one capable of testing every theory investigators had built over several years. Unlike witness memories, scientific evidence doesn't rely on recollection. It asks a much simpler question: what do the physical traces actually reveal? During the years following the murders, forensic science continued advancing, especially in the growing field of DNA analysis. Evidence collected from the crime scene could now be examined using techniques unavailable when investigators first entered the burned building. For detectives, this represented an extraordinary opportunity. Science might finally confirm whether their investigation had identified the correct offenders. The expectation seemed straightforward. If the confessions reflected reality, the forensic evidence should generally support the prosecution's case. Instead, the results introduced uncertainty where investigators had hoped to find clarity. DNA recovered from evidence became one of the most debated aspects of the entire investigation. The available genetic material did not provide the simple confirmation many expected after years of investigative work. Rather than resolving disagreements, the forensic findings raised new questions about how every piece of evidence fit together. Some samples could not conclusively identify a single individual. Others failed to strengthen the prosecution's theory as anticipated. Investigators now faced two competing realities. They had confessions pointing one direction and scientific evidence raising difficult questions in another. Neither reality could simply be ignored, forcing prosecutors and defense attorneys to prepare for an increasingly complex legal battle. Outside the courtroom, public opinion became sharply divided as details slowly emerged through media coverage and court filings. Some believed the confessions settled the case beyond reasonable doubt. Others questioned whether those admissions could truly be trusted. Families of the victims continued waiting for certainty, while legal arguments focused increasingly on evidence rather than emotion. Each side interpreted the available facts differently, illustrating how the same investigation could produce remarkably different conclusions. The closer observers looked at the evidence, the less straightforward the case appeared. Instead of approaching a clear ending, the investigation entered one of its most uncertain chapters. Court proceedings would soon determine whether the available evidence could withstand the demanding standards required for criminal convictions. That process would examine every confession, every forensic report, and every investigative decision made since the night of the murders. For the first time, the entire case would face detailed scrutiny inside a courtroom rather than an interrogation room. What began as one of Texas's most devastating homicide investigations was becoming one of its most closely examined criminal prosecutions. The search for justice was no longer centered only on identifying suspects. it now depended on determining which evidence could truly be trusted. As the trials moved forward, one extraordinary question lingered over every courtroom session. Could a confessed crime still remain officially unresolved? The courtroom promised something investigators had searched for over many years: certainty based on evidence rather than suspicion or unanswered questions. Prosecutors presented a case built around the confessions, arguing they revealed the events inside the yogurt shop with convincing detail. Defense attorneys saw the same evidence very differently, insisting the confessions deserved far more scrutiny before anyone accepted them as reliable. They questioned how the statements had been obtained and whether prolonged interrogations had influenced what eventually appeared in those confessions. The debate reached beyond simple guilt or innocence. It challenged how investigators determine whether a confession reflects truth or pressure. Jurors now faced an unusually difficult responsibility, weighing admissions against physical evidence that failed to provide every expected answer. Some parts of the prosecution's case appeared persuasive, others raised questions that neither side could easily resolve. The burned crime scene continued casting a long shadow over every argument presented inside the courtroom. Evidence destroyed by fire could never be recovered, leaving investigators to reconstruct critical moments using only what had survived. Every missing piece increased the importance of the evidence that remained, making each forensic finding far more significant. Experts explained the limitations of evidence collected from a severely damaged scene, reminding everyone that absence of proof is not proof of absence. Even so, the unanswered forensic questions could not simply be dismissed when evaluating such serious criminal charges. The legal proceedings unfolded over several years, reflecting the extraordinary complexity surrounding nearly every aspect of the investigation. As appeals and hearings continued, public confidence in the original investigation gradually became more divided. Some observers believed investigators had identified the right suspects despite imperfections in the available evidence. Others believed the inconsistencies were too significant to ignore, especially where confessions and forensic findings failed to fully align. The case slowly became part of a much broader conversation about criminal investigations, evidence, and the reliability of admissions made during questioning. Across the United States, researchers were increasingly examining documented cases involving disputed or demonstrably false confessions. Those discussions naturally brought renewed attention to the yogurt shop murders, where similar questions continued emerging throughout the legal process. The central issue remained remarkably difficult. Could someone confess to participating in a crime without accurately describing everything that happened? Courts continued reviewing the convictions, examining whether the available evidence met the legal standards required to uphold such serious verdicts. The process moved carefully, recognizing that criminal convictions demand confidence supported by reliable evidence rather than lingering uncertainty. Eventually, major developments reshaped the future of the case in ways few people had anticipated. The convictions obtained during earlier proceedings were overturned, reopening questions many believed had already been settled. For the victims' families, the decision reopened emotional wounds they had struggled with for years. Instead of bringing finality, the legal system returned the investigation to a place of profound uncertainty. The overturned convictions did not determine who committed the murders. They addressed whether the convictions themselves could legally stand. That distinction proved crucial because an unresolved investigation is very different from a confirmed conclusion. Prosecutors now faced an extraordinarily difficult decision about whether the remaining evidence justified another trial. Without stronger supporting evidence, repeating the prosecution carried significant legal and practical challenges. Investigators revisited forensic material once again, hoping advances in science might answer questions left unresolved by earlier examinations. Every improvement in DNA technology renewed cautious optimism that surviving evidence might still reveal something previously overlooked. Yet science can examine only the evidence that exists. It cannot recreate material permanently destroyed decades earlier. That reality continued limiting what investigators could conclusively establish about the events inside the yogurt shop. As years passed, several investigative theories remained under discussion, but none achieved universal acceptance among those familiar with the case. Law enforcement maintained that the murders remained officially unsolved despite the lengthy investigation and earlier prosecutions. That single fact surprised many people learning about the case for the first time. How could one investigation produce confessions, trials, convictions, overturned verdicts, and still end without an officially identified killer? The answer lies in the distinction between suspicion, legal proof, and historical certainty, three ideas that do not always reach the same conclusion. Some investigators remained convinced they had identified those responsible despite the legal outcome. Others believed the remaining inconsistencies required continued caution before drawing any definitive conclusions. For historians and legal scholars, the yogurt shop murders became more than a homicide investigation. It evolved into a case study exploring forensic science, investigative methods, and the challenges of balancing confessions against physical evidence. The victims themselves, however, remained at the heart of every discussion, reminding everyone what had truly been lost that December night. Decades had passed, but four families were still living with questions no courtroom had completely answered. Investigators continued preserving evidence, recognizing that future scientific advances might someday provide information unavailable to earlier generations. Cold cases sometimes find answers many years later, not because memories improve, but because technology evolves beyond previous limitations. Whether that will happen here remains uncertain, but the possibility continues shaping how the evidence is preserved today. More than 30 years after the fire, the search for certainty had not ended. It had simply entered another generation. The final chapter of this extraordinary case was still unwritten, leaving one lasting question that investigators continue asking to this day. 3 decades have passed, yet the evidence collected that December night remains carefully preserved, waiting for answers science may still uncover. The investigation has never been officially closed. Detectives continue reviewing information whenever new leads or forensic opportunities become available. Unlike many famous cold cases, this one is unusual because investigators once believed they had already reached the finish line. Confessions had been obtained, suspects were prosecuted, convictions were secured, yet certainty remained frustratingly beyond reach. For many people, those facts seem impossible to reconcile. How can a case appear solved and unsolved at the same time? The answer rests in the difference between investigative belief and legal proof, two standards that do not always arrive together. Police may believe they identified those responsible, while courts require evidence capable of surviving the highest legal scrutiny. In the yogurt shop murders, that distinction became the defining feature of the entire investigation. The case has since been examined by legal scholars, forensic specialists, and investigators studying how complex criminal investigations can unfold. Many point to the damaged crime scene as the investigation's greatest obstacle, where crucial physical evidence disappeared before it could ever be examined. Others focus on the disputed confessions, asking how investigators should evaluate admissions that remain controversial decades after they were given. Neither question has produced universal agreement, which explains why discussion surrounding the case continues even today. Advances in DNA technology have transformed countless cold cases across America, identifying victims, suspects, and long-hidden connections once considered impossible. Each breakthrough elsewhere naturally raises another question. Could the same scientific progress someday unlock answers hidden inside this investigation? For now, investigators have never announced evidence capable of conclusively identifying every person responsible for the murders. That uncertainty leaves the case suspended between history and hope, where unanswered questions remain part of its lasting legacy. Behind every forensic debate are 4 young lives that deserve to be remembered for far more than the mystery surrounding their deaths. Amy Ayres was only 13, beginning a life filled with possibilities that ended before most teenagers finish middle school. Sarah and Jennifer Harbison were sisters whose family lost them both during the same unimaginable night. Eliza Thomas was preparing for adulthood, unaware that an ordinary evening at work would become her final day. Their families have spent decades carrying a burden no investigation, courtroom, or scientific report has been able to completely lift. Time changes cities, neighborhoods, and even buildings, but it rarely changes the questions left behind by unresolved violence. The frozen yogurt shop is gone, yet the events connected to that location remain deeply woven into Austin's history. For younger generations discovering this case today, the mystery often feels as immediate as it did in 1991. Perhaps that is why this investigation continues drawing attention from journalists, researchers, and people searching for answers long after headlines disappeared. Some mysteries survive because witnesses never came forward. Others survive because crucial evidence was lost before anyone understood its importance. The yogurt shop murders remain unforgettable because both tragedies collided during one devastating December night. Until new evidence changes what is currently known, the official record remains unchanged. 4 victims, no final convictions, an unsolved case. If this documentary encouraged you to think differently about the investigation, we'd love to hear your respectful perspective in the comments below. And if you'd like us to explore another carefully researched historical crime case, subscribe, share your suggestion, and join us for the next investigation.